The following podcast is sponsored by Basico. At Basico, we understand your needs and pain points. Our expertise in CFO services, legal, finance IT, and people and payroll helps drive your business forward by inspiring change and challenging norms. We believe in deep explorative discussions and critical angles, the same spirit that fuels the Only Constant podcast hosted by our own Lasse Rindom. Discover more about Basico's vision and services at basico.dk. And if you like what you hear in this episode, please don't hesitate to share it with a friend. And now Lasse, take it away.
You are listening to The Only Constant, a podcast where we go beyond the usual discussions in technology and business and aim to explore more than explain. Join me for engaging discussions with a diverse range of global thought leaders as we seek to uncover new perspectives and insights in a free-flowing conversation. My guest today is Nicolai Storm Lund, and I am your host, Lasse Rindom. Hi Nicolai, and welcome to The Only Constant. I am super happy that you're here with me today in the office, actually when the rest of the office is out on holiday, but we two just joined up for a soda and a chat here on The Only Constant, so thank you for doing that with me.
And thank you for having me, Lasse. I've been looking forward to it.
So, Nicolai, you call yourself a technology midwife, so that's that you put that yourself on your LinkedIn profile. So please help me give birth to this Gen AI revolution. What is the first page in your book when it comes to new technology in an enterprise?
Well, I guess the first page contains a sentence that says, "Don't fall in love with technology," which might be a little bit of a paradox for somebody who is head of technology currently in Velux, right? Mm. But the thing is, I think for all of us who has been in the game for quite a while is that we know that it's so much easier to fall in love with new platforms, investing in new technology, than it is to decommission the old ones, right? Mm-hmm. So we kind of tend to end up just piling up new technologies and not doing the needed housekeeping on the rear end of things, right? So I think that would be, my going-in statement. Challenge your why every time we look for new tech. What is it that we're trying to solve here?
But also, so now you're saying also, and I'm going into the midwife, analogy here. So You're saying, don't fall in love with the baby.
Yeah, I guess the thing with the midwife analogy here is it's not the midwife who's giving birth, right? For very obvious reasons, and it's not the midwife who is the birth doctor, at least not in Denmark, right? That's two different roles. The midwife is there to create safe surroundings. Ensure that procedures are followed, ensuring that the person giving birth has whatever she needs in order for succeeding with what's going on, right? And I think that's kind of what I do. I create safe surroundings. I steer the process. I help giving birth to new projects. And I call for help when needed, right? And that's a part of, birth is a life and death situation. And once in a while, you need help and you need intervention. And that's kind of my role in all of this.
But you also said you decommission stuff, so you're also the reaper, I don't know, maybe not the reaper, but
I guess the midwife analogy kind of stops there. But in all fairness,
but I can also decommission this baby for you if you want that. No.
Let's not go there. Let's not go there. No, but I think that there is an important point in being able to say no. Mm. Because again, working with tech people and, I have the same DNA myself here, is that it's so easy to, fall in love with a technology that doesn't necessarily have a use case, a purpose, right? And I have a very good employee of mine, Henrik, who, when I met him the first time, he said, Nicolai, I've always wanted a 3D printer. So I had to go find something I had to 3D print. So I had a reason to buy it, right? And I think, that's a perfect small example of, you really like this gadget. So now I better go find a reason for buying it, right? And I think, once in a while, we tend to do that a little bit, being in technology. We get a cool demo, we see it in a conference, whatever it is, YouTube video, and then we start looking for a place to implement it.
So you're saying instead of, people buying a large, plasma smart screen, don't plasma anymore, but LED, super LED or something smart screen, and then complaining there's nothing to watch?
Yeah, or, it ends up, you watch the same content in the same quality as always because the source doesn't really support the destination, right? So I think, it's like Spotify, right? You buy this awesome high fidelity stereo and then you go with a Spotify audio source, right? Doesn't really make sense.
It still doesn't make sense. I just did that and it does make a little sense because the speakers actually make a difference. But you hit me.
Oops. Sorry about that.
No, but I think you're onto some. You're definitely onto something that's real here. That we do this to make it fun and all. But within AI, for instance. Do you feel the same way there? Do you feel that this is just something where we're just so desperately looking for use case, or don't you see the use case? There must be a reason Microsoft is betting its.
Yeah.
They say they're betting the existence. I don't know. Microsoft's quite big, but you get my point.
Yeah, I get your point. No, of course there is a use case. I think that's hopefully not up for debate. Do I think that 90%, 95% of what we talk about when we talk about AI is more hype and buzz than its value? Yeah. I do, right? I think we have all seen our share of action figure pictures on LinkedIn, right? People making themselves into an action figure. That's all fun and games, but what is the environmental footprint of that compute that is, have rendered that picture? And, is that really all there is to it? And of course, the answer is no, that there's much more to it than that. But I think the 5% really value-adding use cases are kind of getting hidden away by the 95% buzz that we are all kind of
But isn't that just temporary? Just like, going to chat rooms in 95 and spending your limited modem connectivity.
No, I think you're spot on. It is a evolution. And I think over time, AI will be embedded as a natural part of the way we work across platforms and projects. So I think the way we work with AI today, the way we consider AI today will be completely different in 5 years or maybe even in 3 years.
But that makes it really difficult to be you, right? You have to give birth to this kid and you don't really know how this kid is going to be or help someone give birth to this kid and you have no clue, will it be a child? Will it be twins? Is it an elephant? What's coming out, right? What's going to be? Maybe the analogy doesn't work here. But the point is, but my point is still, you don't know exactly what's going to happen with this. So how are you actually positioning it? With the way you just said 95% is hype. So are you saying, we need to demand production value from it right now? Are you just playing around with it, or are you? How are you managing the teams that are supposed to work with Nicolai saying, I believe this will be good in 5 years? Right now, we have no clue. 95% of everything you come with is hype. So what do you actually do? Because I know you have teams working with this as well.
Yeah, so first a disclaimer. So in my context, I don't own AI in our setup. So maybe that's an important disclaimer. But, I obviously hold an executive role in our management of technology. So obviously I'm highly involved anyway. I think you have to set aside a certain willing of human capital to work with innovation and technology. And I think that has to go for whatever technology platform it could be that should have a certain exposure. You have to figure out where do you position yourself in your willingness to invest this human capital or monetary capital for that sake in terms of playing around with new technology, because you don't necessarily know the financial business case, the use case, the productivity gain, etc. up front. Usually you don't, right? But you need to figure out how much playing time do you allow for. When you pitched this idea of today's podcast with me, it made me think of the time 10 years back when any corporate company with a certain respect for themselves had to create a digital garage. I think you recall those days where everybody had to have this mimicking a Silicon Valley startup where you could draw on the walls and ties were not allowed and you didn't sit in an office chair but in a swing. Things had to be...
I've spoken about those on the podcast before, Spot, yes.
There you go, right.
Innovation theaters, Thor Dankert called them as well.
We have all seen it, right? Yeah. And I think most of them, if not all of them, are gone now, right? But the idea was good. But it was so difficult to transfer this ideation fabric into valuable business cases. And I think, that's not the same thing as saying that we didn't learn from it. I think we have learned from it. And I think there's takeaways that several of us are still piggybacking upon. I think the same thing will be happening here, right? We play around and you have to allow for a certain level of, let's say, trial and error. But you need to keep it under control, right? Because you can invest, all your revenue on playing around with AI and still not maybe making, this nuclear innovation that you hope for.
But there's a difference here, right, between these garages or these innovation theaters, because they were sort of top down, often decided we need to have these places where people can draw on the walls. But right now there's a lot of innovation also going on bottoms up, right? There's a lot of people working with AI. Isn't that a difference? Don't you feel that's a difference? Don't you see that in Velux as well?
I think it's both, right? I think there's not a business executive out there who want to miss out on the potential outcomes of AI, because everybody have been hearing about that AI is here and it's going to revolutionize the world as we have known it until now. So I think what is unique with what we're facing now is that it's happening both top down and bottom up at the same time, because how often does C-levels really show interest in, and whatever new technology that is arising? Usually that interest comes off of inspiration coming bottom up. But in this case, it comes from outside in and is challenging, the mindset of the C-levels, which is why they, come up with, I would say what I hear in the market is pretty firm opinions on what level of sponsorship AI projects are getting, because you don't want to be the one who missed out.
No.
So in that sense, I think it's a little bit unique to what we usually see in technology.
Yeah, because I tended to say, and I'd still somehow say that there's a strategic deficit in the AI market where we don't know what we want to do with this. What is the reason we do this? What do we want to use it for, right? But some of this is also being answered by, of course, a lot of engineering people just doing things in engineering. The whole innovation theaters, or Stuart Winter on the podcast called it also these data and AI analytics departments that is often also sort of slightly misaligned with production and real value.
Yes.
Just sitting there doing things with data, but suddenly people working real stuff is also starting to work with this technology. So there is something touching each other here, or are they misaligned? That may be my question. Are they linked together? Do they listen to each other? Do they work together? Do they do the same thing?
I think it's a good question, and I obviously can only talk, from in terms of what I'm experiencing. But I think the reality is that it can be both. In our context, we at least try to create a governance that makes them talk together, right? But it's different dynamics. Let's take a tangible example, but any large-scale enterprise platform out there has an AI module these days, whether it's Salesforce or ServiceNow or SAP or Workday or SuccessFactors, whatever it is, everybody have an AI add-in, right? But is that the same type of AI innovation as would be happening in an AI center of excellence that you have built as an isolated team? I don't think so, right? That's two very different dynamics. So maybe they can coexist without actually being any path of collision.
That's difficult, right? It is so multimodal, sort of. It sort of moves in so many different spheres and across the entire stack, right, of everything an enterprise has. So you both have the personal productivity chatbot that everyone's working with, but that's not the same as an agent in SAP, and it's not the same as an AI workflow, right? There's multiple levels to this all the time.
Exactly.
Meaning, is it the same thing we're talking about? And when boardrooms go, say, we need 5 AI projects next year, do you even know what they're counting?
No, exactly. And that's back to the hype thing, right? I saw a LinkedIn post the other day stating, that whatever company had implemented a successful AI transformation, which turned out to be a full stack implementation of Microsoft Copilot, right?
Right.
And I have absolutely nothing against Copilot. I think, it's a good tool for whatever it does, right? But can you really say that you have done a full scale AI company implementation when you have implemented?
Did you say transformation first?
I might have, and I now actually.
Because I always said transformation. I was like, now you are pushing it.
Exactly. Fair point. Fair point. But it's kind of back to this. Is it when it's becoming an off-the-shelf product, it drives for a different operating model than actually building a bespoke innovation that is specifically related to your industry and your data set. And I think those two dynamics are not comparable.
But and the obvious question here is, are every company the same suddenly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And obviously the answer is not, right? But it's a good point, right? It's a brilliant point. So it's.
I said that. I think I said in one of the other episodes as well, and now I'm repeating myself. But I also said, the cloud is someone else's computer, right? Low code is someone else's code, and AI is someone else's data. And now, are we even different anymore? Will we be less different, or will we all be the same Copilot companies?
No, but as you most likely also see in your dialogues, is that a lot of companies are now doing their own AI hubs, which I think makes a lot of sense, right? So you're trying to take your own data sets and train your own models on to create agents or workloads that is based on your own data sets, which, is an example of something that can, at least in theory, makes a lot of sense. So, you're trying to combine these worlds, the off-the-shelf products with, bespoke configuration and training models in your context and seeing, what that can lead to. So, I would say the worlds are already meeting somewhere in the middle right now. So, but how that looks like in a year from now or two, it's difficult to predict.
But how are you then? How are you, as a technology midwife, enabling these teams that are doing these things?
I would say, first of all, by stepping extremely carefully here, because there's a certain risk associated with this as well, because these innovation, let's call it playgrounds, has to coexist with a business that is already running, a business that, is operating 24/7 around the globe. In our case, we are a manufacturing business. We have cybersecurity risk to obviously worry about as well. We need to ensure operational resilience, etc. So, you need to try to create a safe space to do, I would say trial and error and testing without jeopardizing your operational integrity. So that's, part of my role. That's obviously to safeguard that, we have the level of freedom that it requires to create, hopefully, innovation without jeopardizing your daily operations. And that's a tricky place to be at.
Yeah, because it's, I always say there's these two mega trends, right? Moving faster, more automation, more speed, and then more cybersecurity, more security, because there's more hackers as well. And both sides are accelerating and could be moving away from each other, because they I don't think they speak naturally the same language.
No.
So being in the middle of that is actually a strain. Do you feel strained? Do you feel like someone's pulling you from both ends?
Yeah, but that has been a constant. Not answering your question here on what is the only constant, but honestly, being in head of operations roles, as I have been in for 20 years or so, I think this is a constant, because you always, most businesses at least, have the dynamics between research and development, so product development, and manufacturing or whatever your operations, right? And quite often they are in conflict, because you have the creative people, who are building, designing, innovating, playing around, and they don't necessarily have the same emotions for large-scale manufacturing, scaling enterprise-grade products around the globe, ensuring 24/7 resilience, with everything that entails, the governance that is absolutely needed to make that type of operations work. You don't necessarily have the same needs or even the same view if you sit in an R&D function. So I would say this dynamic that you're describing here, it's not new. I think it's a given. You always have that dynamic.
But you, I remember when I pitched RPA to you at one point, and you had this extremely pragmatic outlook on it, and I always cherish that. But I've also met people and executives, a lot of them that are either on one side or the other, being like super restrictive, super afraid, super angry at things that are outside of their control, or someone who's just like, yeah, let's just do whatever, we don't care, let's just pretend there are no rules, right? So we met both of them, but being exactly there in the middle, saying, yes, that's a good idea, let's definitely do that, but you have to just comply with this and that, and we can maybe be lenient on this right here, right?
But I think pragmatism is part of the job description. You really need to pick your battles, and you need to.
But can you be pragmatic if you don't understand it?
No, but that's a good point. And that often requires a lot of investment in actually trying to understand, because when I take on my cybersecurity hat, I hold a CISO role as well in Velux. Then we always have the saying that you can only protect what you know exists, right? You need to understand what the context is to protect something, right? But that requires us to invest an awful lot of time in understanding the context we're in, the dynamics of whatever platform. So that's you're spot on, and that's an investment we have to do. So either you do that, or you do segregation, meaning that then you create a safe space for this that is segregated out of the operational existence of the rest of your environment. Sometimes that's possible, but often whoever wants to build a new product needs production data to play around with, right? And that is something we often cannot allow, but we can maybe do something that mimics production data, so close enough to get the real experience.
So I was just about to say, so I'm sitting here next to the smartest man in Denmark here, or Europe or whatever, because as I just said, you're pragmatic, so you must understand a lot of the things you meet because you're pragmatic. But then you said, but often my go-to answer would be to say, okay, let's make a safe space over here, let's make a container, put you in there, and lock the door and have fun, right? Because you need to understand what you're doing, what will this impact, but sometimes it's just so novel that you don't know what you're playing around with. And that must be, how does it make you feel that all of the big application suites are building agents right now?
Well, first of all, I'm fine with that. I have to admit that I have a certain gut feeling that there's a lot of rebranding going on. So in some cases, I doubt how much AI is actually behind the new labels that is being applied to them. But I take that on my shoulders. I don't know, if that's the case. But I would say it's amazing how many manufacturers suddenly have managed to get AI in production.
The marketing thing, definitely. Okay, there's definitely AI in everything now. And there's some providers even have AI on all the marketing slides and all that. But I've also seen from big providers some of the things that they are actually building. That is agents that can make decisions that do not have a trigger and a defined outcome, but actually lives within a process. So it can go either way from whatever starting point. So there's this. They are these weird virtual digital twin. That is actually a digital twin, a person, a digital something that does something, right? But still, it's a stochastic.
Yeah,
technology.
And to some extent, it's super exciting, and it's not a boring time to be alive. That's for sure. Do I have concern? Of course, that's a part of the job description. I have to be concerned, right? And do I believe we fully understand the impact of what we're doing from a risk perspective? No, I don't. I think there's so many things that we have only seen the tip of the iceberg, and I think it's difficult to backtrack on. Right, we can't back out of it. You cannot unlearn what you have learned. So I think we are in it for an interesting journey in front of us. But again, talking from a cybersecurity perspective. This also unleashes a completely new set of challenges that we have yet to figure out how to deal with.
In 5 years, will you be sitting around weeding out a lot of AI solutions you don't believe in? Is that, you said that decommission, that was also part of the job, right? And I had a friend once who said that all IT professionals are just well-paid janitors, right?
But he's not wrong.
No.
He's not wrong.
If your code still works in 10 years, something's wrong in the company, right? He also said something like that because you have to kill it.
But if I'm, kind of looking back at, I've been in IT for 25 years, and some of the topics we have been discussing haven't really changed. The amount of times I've been involved in fixing the basics projects. I think everybody working in infrastructure, IT infrastructure, technology, CTO offices, they have been a part of fixing the basics, getting rid of technology depth. But the thing is, you will always have technology depth. It never goes away. So
it's the second constant you mentioned.
It's the second constant. Oh my goodness, it's gonna be a long wrap up today, Lasse. But that's just the fact, right? As I mentioned before, unfortunately, it's so much easier acquiring new platforms, new technology, than it is to untangle them of business processes and actually manage to decommission them and put them in a box and get them out of the door. So there's a mismatch between your ability to acquire and adopt new technology and your ability to decommission old technology. So well-paid janitors, I think that's, it's an absolutely fair analogy, but it's not unique for AI. I think for whatever new technology it is, you mentioned, I think I heard you mentioning low-code, no-code earlier, right? I think it's a brilliant, example, because it introduced some of the same challenges, and small grassroots development initiatives became enterprise grade production critical systems that were by no means ready for that purpose, but it was suddenly possible, right? And then somebody inherits that at some point and have to make it enterprise grade. So either you scrap it and start all over, or you wrap it into something else, right?
I don't know if you've heard this one, but Kate O'Neill on episode 50 said that technical debt, like any debt, is because you believe in the future. So you make a debt because you believe you can pay it back, right? Does that make you think differently around it? I love that quote, because that's how when I make a debt, when I buy something with my wife or whatever, it's because I believe that me and my wife will have a future, and I believe that I'll be able to pay what I buy.
Yeah, it's I like the picture. Well, I guess at the end of the day, it's about it's two things, right? It's about return of investment. So when have whatever implementation served its purpose? That could be one dimension to it, right? When something has kind of outlived itself, you need to get it out of the door. But it could also be just realizing that it was a wrong bet, which often is even more difficult, because if you have actually had a return of investment, it's so much easier to accept that I have had this car for 10 years.
Some things that has had a return on investment can also be a wrong bet at scale.
Yes. That's a painfully good point. And I think all of us who have been trying to do proof of concepts have seen that something that was a successful proof of concept ended up not scaling when it came to large-scale enterprise operations.
Let me put, because I wanted to ask you about this. When are we truly successful with new technologies? I wanted to ask you that. That's one of the things I wrote down some questions before the podcast. So I want to ask you about that, about POCs. When are they successful enough to be called successful, right? When are we truly successful with new technologies? But also, let me just say that in a different way. Does all technology have to hit IT operations at some point and be easy to manage before, or manageable in an IT operations umbrella before it's successful?
No.
RPA kept on being a project,
Yeah. No, I think the short answer is no. Let's keep operations aside for a second, then first of all, what is definition of success? What is it that you're trying to achieve here? I assume the reason why you would do a POC is to qualify a hypothesis, right? You have a mental picture of this platform, tool, service, whatever, will serve a business purpose of some sort. That you might prove that or disprove that in a POC. So a successful POC is a good start, but it's definitely not the end. So whether a project or technology implementation is successful or not, I don't think that answer can be one-dimensional, because there's a lot of nuances in success criteria. Is it about risk reduction? Is it about regaining stability of a service? Is it about performance? Is it an addition of functionality? Is it user experience? A new UX? Or is it a financial business case? I've done tons of projects that were solely done because they had a positive ROI. Right? We reduced cost of operations. Maybe even with a reduced user experience at, that's the price you pay with, right? So, if you manage to cut cost, was it a successful project? Well, if that's your success criteria, then, it could be a tech project that ended up with a cost reduction. Users might not like you afterwards, but the CFO does. So, again, it's difficult to say
then
when
the CEO maybe not do not. I mean, the CMO does. Now you have the problem, right?
But that's spot on, right? So defining success criteria is a super important starting point. Back to visiting your why. What is it exactly we're trying to achieve here? How does good look like?
So it's not about, for technology that it goes into IT operations some point, and it's easy to manage. That doesn't matter.
Oh, to me, it obviously does. I would say as I have grown older, fortunately, I have come to appreciate this very old Einstein quote, where I think he's quoted for having said something that any brilliant fool can make something complicated, but it takes a genius to make something simple, right? And I, even though that I have a hard...
Also, I wrote you a long letter. If I'd had more time, I would have made you a short
That's
one.
Pascal.
Yeah, that's also a good one.
But exactly, but it's spot on, because the amount of effort it takes to relay a simple message is actually usually bigger than writing 10 pages, right? And if you have to write an executive summary, you cannot give them a 10-page abstract, right? You need to get to the point. And the level of understanding you need to have to relay a complicated message in a simple way is, very, very high. So, as I've grown older, and I would say in the space of technology, I've come to appreciate platforms that allows for easy operations, ease of use, etc. The amount of times I've found myself in owning or adopting, inheriting, whatever, technology platforms built by presumably brilliant minds.
Inheriting, I guess, is the worst, right?
Yeah, but that's obviously quite often a given unless you stay with your employer for many, many years, which I had in the past. But the amount of times I've found myself, owning platforms with super high complexity, with, some super impressive specs is I would say, significant. But the problem is that you needed a rocket engineer to operate it, right? There was this one person in Denmark you could call, and he's the guy. Unfortunately, he's now retired, right? And at the end of the day, then you have to question, so all these impressive specs, whether it's, the amount of compute or latency or whatever it could be, but do you need it? What was the purpose again for provisioning this, right? When is it good enough? And today, I would always go with good enough if I would get higher operability, ease of use, better UX, lower complexity, easier troubleshooting, whatever it is, then, a great spec sheet. I think it's the iPhone experience.
So do you always buy the most sold family car of last year?
No, but now you're touching my babies. But I always consider.
It sounds like that, It sounds like you would do that.
Yeah, no, but I think there's a place.
Yeah, but everyone has it. I can ask my friend next door. He has the same car.
But I always evaluate the full package. The full ownership experience. Because let's take the opposite end of that statement. There's a group of people who bought with good intent the Fisker Ocean SUV, which I would understand because on paper it looked like an amazing vehicle. But unfortunately, the support model does no longer exist, right? Because they went bankrupt, right? So I think that's an example of, due diligence that you could have done and you might have done and accepted the risk. I'm definitely not judging. But I think, back to the point is that, where's your risk appetite? In this, where do you make your compromise? Because it is always a compromise. And I always, in technology selections, as well as my choice of vehicle, try to kind of evaluate the full package. What risk am I going into? Is this, unfounded ground in terms of new technology? What is the risk of, having idle time of 3 months in a workshop because they can't figure it out versus, the full cost of ownership? I try to evaluate it, in its full extent.
Yeah, the things we can see, right? Is obviously we can't see if it breaks down and the way it will break down in 2 or 3 years. There's some things we just don't know how it will unfold, right?
Well, I partially agree. If you buy bleeding edge technology, then that is the case. But if you buy proven technology, then there's a lot of statistical data that you can lean towards, right?
Yeah.
And I would say for a lot of enterprises, it most likely goes that 80-90% stack is proven technology, and then they have 20.
But the difficulty with AI was always, that there was everyone and most people I've talked to wanted to imitate someone. They want to do what everyone else has done. They always ask me, what has everyone else done? What are the use cases you've done everywhere else? And I'm like, come on, guys, this is something that's been out for 2.5 years. It was honestly completely novel 2.5 years ago. Like, took everyone by surprise that it worked this well. Even people in the AI space were like, oh, so it worked, that they scaled it, And now you're sitting here saying, what have people done at scale before me? No one, has, but you want to work with it. So that is actually a very, very difficult position for a consultant to be in, and an advisor to be in, saying, what should we tell you to do? Because I don't know.
No.
I know, I have ideas. I see more than you do, but I still can't see to the end of it. I don't have this. With RPA, I've also said we always had these banks who had their legacy mainframes and all. They've done things with automation since the 80s. Some of them actually on top of their systems, right? So we had some learnings, and then they were just bundled into an RPA platform. But this time we don't have that.
No.
So how do we imitate? Everyone's on, creative now. They're not just an imitation. They're on reinventing, right? That makes a different strain on this, doesn't it?
Absolutely it does, and I think all of us has to kind of evaluate our own strategy on in this area. I would strongly assume that your choice of ambitions depends a lot of the industry you're in, because at the end of the day, it is a strategy. I know that you and I, not too long ago, discussed the fact that you can very easily find yourself in having invested, an unknown amount of millions into some bespoke AI configuration that will become an off-the-shelf product, within months. So, whatever you did will become a commodity before you're even done with your own configuration, right?
That's the next challenge, yeah.
Exactly. And I think, that's just a risk you have to live with, if you want to be in the groundbreaking space here potentially, or in greenfield space at least. And for some industries, I don't think you have a choice. And now we are in physical manufacturing of building material, in our case, windows, right? So we might not have to be the front runners of the AI revolution, but we need to keep an open eye, constant eye on it, to avoid obviously missing out on opportunity, as we always have to, by the way. But that risk you're alluding to here, I think we don't have a choice. You just need to evaluate your risk strategy and your risk appetite. How much risk can you accept? Because as you will step into a lot of unpaved ground. With the risk of spending money on something.
But again, if you do, as you said, if you do something that has value, if you solve the problem or ask the why, right? So if you have your why, or this is a challenge. Let's see if we can fix it with this technology, and then you end up maybe spending too many millions fixing it with that technology, and then 2 months later it's commodity. But you still overall get the problem fixed.
Yes, exactly.
So that's why finding the right why is more important than finding the right technology.
Exactly.
Still, right? Because in the end of the day, okay, maybe that became commodity. Who could have known, right?
Exactly. The one thing is a tooling discussion. The other thing is kind of a value proposition discussion, right? Yeah. So I agree, and I think that's the right focus to have, because if that's your focus, then you will be successful then you might change direction in terms of tooling, in terms of how you solve it. But you found the why, and you hopefully have gained efficiency or created more value proposition than you had before, however that looks like in your industry, right?
But the problem with the why then, okay, and let's get into that, is also that that becomes very granular, right? It's sort of like then we have to look at these minuscule different value props everywhere and whys and why we're doing things. And in this process here in this department, in this country, it makes sense to do this. Oh, okay, good. Then we do it there. And you can't go around on a board level. You say, okay, we want to be AI ready. We want to be data driven. We want to be data transforming, right? But does that even make sense to say then, Nicolai?
Well, you have a point, but I think there is potential ways to organize yourself around that, because obviously this will lead to a lot of ideas and nuclear development. Atomic development, that will impose a gain or efficiency gain to a subset of your organization, maybe on a very small level. But I think you can kind of, I think the concept of ideation factories actually makes sense. So if you kind of collect input and you test, the hypothesis coming out of it to figure out if it scales and if it's worth the investment to adopt and implement on a global scale, then you can, if you imagine having a portfolio of 100 ideas coming in from your AI community, and then you qualify it, and then
you've given 100 different sets of production data.
Well, maybe it could be the same set of production data, right? But 100 different ideas. But I think you can qualify where it's worth the investment, but it takes an effort to get there, and it takes a lot of testing, and it also requires you to be able to decommission ideas that somebody liked, and it might even have been a positive business case for a small subset of your organization, but you're still not having it because it doesn't scale or it's not relevant for the greater good. So it just adds complexity at the end of the day.
So if we imagine this is a little bit blurry, but it is there. We imagine there is an idea layer or something where people have lots of things, ideas they know can do it. Then you have a pressure from top, which they want to say, we want to be AI ready, we want to be AI first, we want to be data transformer, whatever we've said before, buzzwords from boards. But then you have also, the whole stack of the things that, are we AI ready? Can we be AI ready? Do we have the data? Do we have the ideas are good? But if the whole processing background is disparate and spread across multiple different systems that do not connect and different data setups and nothing's available, no one's even wanted to touch the master data cleaning project for years.
It's again, obviously it's a fair point, but to me that sounds more like a premise we have to work around than something that you have to solve as an enabler. Because when you use the word ready, to me that sounds like something that would be a moving target. Because when are you truly ready? Technology evolves constantly, right? So the whole theme of readiness, is not fixed. And I think, we have adopted a ton of technology that we weren't ready for. If you zoomed out, let's take the Corona times. I think, you saw millions of people overnight having to work from home. Companies that were not really digital empowered found their way, and they got ready, right? Very fast because they had to. So I don't think you're ever fully ready. But unfortunately, we have to figure it out anyway, right? So, and we will find our way.
Yeah, but there's this weird thing, right? And something that preoccupies me a lot right now is this whole, as I said before, if you have this, they take the idea of the full digital twin AI agent, right? Moving only in digital spaces, right? He, she, it, whatever it is,
I don't know,
will not deal well with ambiguity because it will have to navigate only in this. There's no human to say, by the way, I can make that decision for you. It has to navigate on its own. So don't we need to get rid of these ambiguities at least? And isn't this very sort of monolithic IT in some ways, right? Very strict, heavy, set, defined. You talk about a flux sort of, right? Where technology moves and we move and we overcome and we work around it, right? But But it seems that they need something different. It's just if I just take the premise of AI agents seriously, right?
But for sure there is different. Well, coming back to the theme that I just tried to decommission here of being ready. Obviously, there is companies that is more ready than others. I think if you go to organizations that have been extremely well structured in terms of data governance and data analytics, I think they are more ready than companies who are not. If you're very, very structured in terms of how you control your data and where you store it, and how you build business logic upon that data, I think your adoption curve into working in a structured way with AI is much shorter than companies who first have to kind of understand the data logic that they even
but
sit
those
upon.
Companies that have all that, and they typically also know data products they're delivering. So they're delivering digital products.
Exactly.
So if you deliver a physical product, I'm not saying you do that in Velux, but sometimes the data is an add-on or is a meta layer, right? It's not the real product.
Exactly.
Right? Whereas a bank, of course, they will have to have that data completely in order.
Spot on. Yeah. On insurance companies, etc., who live off statistics. And
so does it make sense that we call for every company in the whole world to say, okay, get data driven, fix your data, make sense of it, or should we look at how should we approach a production company like yours?
No, but I truly believe that it makes sense for all, but not to the same extent, because we don't suddenly get to become a data driven company overnight just because AI entered the scene, right? But that doesn't mean that data is not important for us. We use tons of data. We have factories across all of Europe with tons of data that's being collected on product quality, returns, sales data. There's so many dimensions to this, and we are a company who's very occupied with our sustainability agenda. So there's a ton of data sets that we try to capture throughout our production life cycle. So it's not like data is not important for us, but it is not the driver for our end product.
No, you don't go around putting IoT into the window saying, oh, now this person looked out 5 times yesterday and it was raining when he did, so now our window he doesn't like.
We're not there. No,
it can very quickly get creepy, right? When we make data products out of things that are not necessarily meant for it, right? Okay, great. But I think that makes sense. I think that's a good small deliberation around that as well. Nicolai, I always say, or take this quote from Enzo Torresi, I think, saying that maybe God made the world in 7 days, but he didn't have an installed base. How is the installed base both a challenge and a real opportunity?
Well, again, in my shoes, it's simply just a premise 99% of the time. I've never worked in a startup company. I've used all of my career in large Danish industrial companies. The oldest one was 150 years old, and the second one was 120 years old, and now Velux is the youngest one, being 80-some years old. Right? Oh, yeah. So there's always a legacy. Chick. Exactly. Yeah, it almost is the startup. Yeah. But it's just the premise, right? We built on a legacy always, right? So I'm really trying to avoid seeing this legacy as an enemy, but instead of an enemy, I see it as a frame for the requirements that I work within, right? It's the corner flags. And I agree that those corner flags can be moved around because, you can eradicate old technology or dependencies, but it takes time, right? As I mentioned before, I've been around enterprise IT for 20-some years now, right? And I simply don't recall a time where we haven't had these discussions about fixing the foundation, as I alluded to before, right? So there's always new depth because there's always systems that are going end of life or out of capacity or have just served their purpose, right? So that's a part of my ecosystem. So instead of fighting the install base, I'm actually trying to embrace it.
You're getting old now, Nicolai.
I know. I can kind of hear what I'm saying, right? but I agree that it comes with limitations. But I guess it's a little bit like
taking that decision to change the system, spending 3 years taking that decision, then starting the project 2 years in, it's already technical debt.
It is right.
Then when you're done with the project, we start over.
Yeah. And I could obviously sit down and dream about a world where I didn't have to take all the legacy technology into consideration in my architecture. But that's unfortunately not a world I live in. So instead of
because production takes business running, it takes time to move these things.
If you take the life cycle of production equipment, it's not like your iPhone, right? It's not investments that will only last for 2 years. It's
and it's not just me being fixed; it's like everyone being fixed.
It's 10, 15, 20-year life cycles often in production technology, right? And even if you wanted to refresh them at a higher rate, then you have an amount of factories to attend to. So that's it's a given, and I try to work with it as a set of I would say a requirement specification that to some extent is given to begin with. And then yes, it's not like I'm just leaning back and I'm not challenging the legacy. I am and I have to, but the install base, so to say, is a given.
It's like people are always hunting speed, right? But I always say that sometimes slow is a design. When you're working with big politics, it's a good idea that it takes time to make a terrible decision, because then you can take another decision as you go. And same way when you have big production installments, right? That it's a good idea sometimes also to have these slow setups that are difficult to change, because that ensures the stability of operations.
Yeah.
Or is that how you look at it as well?
No, well, there's a little bit of truth to it. It's like one of my wife's favorite quotes is that sometimes the fastest way to get there is to go slow, and there's some truth to that, right? Because in high complex environment, there is a ton of dependencies, and it would be a fantastic world where all dependencies were documented and mapped out. Unfortunately, I haven't visited that world yet. There's always surprises, and with time comes insight, and that insight is needed in order for us to prioritize and to learn, I would say. So there is an opportunity, but it's in it. But it's always I agree that it's always a balance between time to market, the size of the investment, the risk that your change is imposing, both cyber risk but also operational risk.
Yeah, but that's a startup problem. Startups don't have any company to lose, right?
Yeah.
You do.
And that's why it's so difficult to imitate the dynamics of a startup, even though that tons of companies have tried to make these startup-like settings, in a garage, right? But it will never be the same dynamic as, doing this in the basement of your mom and dad.
No, and I think Tom Goodman said he was always wondering why enterprises never had kids.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't, talk about end of life for myself, and then dynasty planning and have a kid, and then invest them and give them some land in Wessex, something so they can run that, be Prince of Wales, and then see,
yes,
and then see how they come to, as a competitor to yourself, right? But maybe that's a thing we need to do more.
Yeah, I think at least it's been tried in a ton of different variations, and I'm sure that there's good research done in the area. But I think the evidence at least goes for that it's difficult to create that energy and passion that you will see coming out of native small-scale startups, and that's why at least in big tech, innovation is bought to a very wide extent, right, from the outside.
But that's also this thing, right? In AI, everyone talking about the one-person billion-dollar company and all that, right? But I always say, but we always also talk about data is important here, right? And when we know things and we can move things with AI, and AI can navigate that data. Startups don't have that. Enterprises do. Isn't that also,
Yeah, no, I think that's true, and I think that's also why you find that some industries are living a very, very solid life with limited competition, because the entry barrier is just way, way, way up there. So there is industries that haven't been disrupted for a very long time, right? If you looked at automotive, they lived a very quiet life until Tesla entered the scene, right? I think that's one of the bigger examples we have from the past 10, 15 years, right?
But also when you put some domain knowledge into things, like I know from these, and there are a lot of time registration softwares, and that's just a thing I know, and I've been annoyed at. A lot of them are terrible, but they live because they have the union rules, or what do you call that, the labor rules, overenskomster in Danish. What's that in English? Union agreements.
Yeah, I guess so.
Something they've built that into their system. And then for some foreign company to come and disrupt that would mean that they would have to employ a couple of lawyers to maintain that as they change, and then they don't. So the barrier for entry is extremely difficult. But the data for this old legacy system is actually their knowledge of that, that setup, and that's why they keep on living, and everyone hates working with it. And
yeah, and I think there's a lot of examples like these out there, right? So it's, once in a while, it's again, embrace it. It's not an enemy. Maybe it's actually your foundation.
Let's talk a little bit about shadow AI, which is a new concept I think is coming up. I don't know if you've heard about it, but the two things to it, right? One is that any system is suddenly AI driven and might take your data and put it to some AI model, right? And you update the system and suddenly you have AI capabilities. How are you approaching that? And also the second thing, how are you approaching the fact that employees suddenly are using AI for things they should not use AI for? Or maybe that's even not on your plate, or is it anyone's plate?
It is absolutely anyone's plate. So your first question is, how should we approach it? I think the answer here is we should approach it very, very carefully. It's tricky. I think we are all aware that AI can absolutely be a multiplier in terms of your performance and your productivity, but it also comes with a set of challenges that you're alluding to here. One of them, which is quite obvious, that even the enterprise tools, the ones that are approved, can actually unleash a lot of things that should have been kept confidential. I can, the first demo I had of Copilot, which is now 1.5 years ago. I asked Microsoft the same question, saying, so what if an employee prompted for all resumes they could find on, SharePoint, Team sites, whatever, OneDrive. It could be
they had access to it. They shouldn't have access to it, but they still.
But that was the answer. Exactly. But that's the thing, right? Because now any person without any real training can prompt in natural language for things that have been confidential for ages, right? And we can all agree that these things should be kept under proper data classification with access restrictions and all
that. You just said all of that is a flux, right?
Exactly. But that's the thing, right? It's kind of a given that unfortunately people don't always do as expected and as the policy dictates. But now you can kind of prompt for confidential data with full intent without being very good at doing queries or whatever it could be, right? It doesn't take any IT skills to do a natural language prompt. So that's kind of a part of the package now, that you kind of unleash a lot of potential to a lot of people, and I think there's kind of two schools in this, and then without revealing which one of them I come from, then you can either try to fight it with force. You can try to block URLs for products you don't want your employees to use, or you can try to educate your way out of it, in combination with coming up with attractive enterprise alternatives that is vetted and in some sort of safe surroundings. And the thing is that, I think you can obviously try to police your way out of it, but we will never get to 100% anyway. The human factor is still by far the biggest factor we have, right? People are surprisingly creative when they, want to, they have their eyes on a goal, right? So they will figure out a way to solve it, right? So I really believe that educating your way out of, first of all, make your employees understand the risk we're dealing with. But I also think that you have to come up with, let's call it whitelisted alternatives, so you can kind of create let's call it a safe playground where you can, make your own experiences, because that's the thing. Everybody, want to be a part of the hype game here, which I fully get, right? So we're all playing around with this.
But that's that makes sense. Give people access to something that's safe for them to play with. But what about all the? Do you have an overview of all the applications in Velux and what they're used for, what people use them for, and if they're adding AI capabilities, and if one of those AI is maybe sending data to I don't know, DeepSeek in China, or do you?
No, I wish, and obviously in this setting I have to claim that I have a very broad overview, but there's always gaps. Like let's just face it. So there's definitely a point here, but I don't think this problem is new as such. I think we have had it for years, and every time a new technology emerges, especially technologies that are addressing the consumers as well, so something that you as a consumer at home would also be playing around with, then we have these discussions. Maybe you recall that in the first months of COVID, we suddenly found ourselves discussing whether we should be using Teams or Skype or Zoom or WebEx or BlueJeans, some of them platforms at that point in time I've not even heard about, right? But suddenly, we had to have a discussion whether it was, the official company-wide Skype platform or some small-scale startup product instead. Why? Because there was some small attractive features. You could do a funny background on Zoom that you couldn't do in Teams, right? Did we fully understand the potential risk of adopting a new conference platform overnight? Of course not, right? Could we enforce a certain usage of an enterprise alternative? Well, you can to some extent, but if people want to use BlueJeans or Zoom instead of Teams, they will find their way around it, right? So I'm not saying that we shouldn't spend time on this. Of course we should. But I'm just saying that I think the risk associated with whatever shadow IT it is, big and small, file sharing services. 10 years ago we discussed whether Dropbox was allowed for enterprise workloads, right? So today that discussion really doesn't exist any longer. But these situations have arisen, for as long as I have been in IT. And yes, there is knowledge we don't have, because there's a lot of things happening behind the scenes that we are not in control of.
Yeah, but I just asked the question because, as you also said, there's a flood of it right now. Every software is AI enabled within 1.5 years. Everything that's not AI is suddenly AI. So there must be, your TPO must be so busy.
Yeah, but it's spot on, and it's difficult to get on par with the ball here because it's so fast moving, and I think education is priority number 1, 2, and 3, because you can't win the fight with technical controls. You can limit it, you can limit the risk, but you can't win it. Because there's a constant evolution of new platforms coming in, and if it's not on the PC web-based, then it's an app on the phone, and if it's not on the phone, then it's on a private device. People will find their way around, right, if they want to play with something. But I don't think the problem here is strictly for enterprises. I think we as consumers are in the same boat, in terms of how we share our data. How we just, with no fear walks into new social media platforms and share private pictures of our kids and whatever it could be, right? I think, we all need to stay educated on the risk that we are walking into when we are adopting technology. And I think that's a big part of the solution here. Stay cautious, right? Who is it that you're delivering your data to? Who is it that you're, storing your family pictures? And what risk are you willing to live with here? What is the worst case scenario? What could this be abused for?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think a lot of people have not been doing that, and a lot of enterprises and businesses have not been doing that good enough, right?
No.
And trying to just move on a train. But also, I think I want to also ask you, and that was part of my second question a little bit. People using AI for things they shouldn't use it for, writing mails to customers. Maybe you're like, okay, that's good enough, but maybe you don't want it to sound just that way. How do you approach something like that? Do you approach that? I think it's a difficult thing. It's also a difficult thing for us, and in the settings I'm in, figuring out when do people use it, when don't they use it. When I see a PowerPoint from a consultant that's overly AI'd. I'm like, did you read? Is this really true? All of this, is that a harsh conclusion? We're really your own, and stuff like that. Just asking those questions.
Yeah. I agree, of course, and I think we all see it, sometimes in small scale and sometimes in big. I think all of us sees the tendency for an overwhelming amount of AI-generated LinkedIn posts, right, where you can suddenly see that, that's not a language you would ever have used. We at least if it's one of your friends or close colleagues who posts it, right? So I think, we see it in all sorts of contexts, but the big question is, if this is something we should and can regulate.
Yeah, that's actually the real question here.
Yeah,
and who should own that if someone should?
Yeah, and I think again, it's not black and white because I think it depends a lot on what industry you're in. I'm sure that there's a ton of companies who have fairly solid vetting processes for any PowerPoints that leaves the company. I would assume that there's some of the very big American tech brands who seems to have a very high level of scrutiny when it comes to PowerPoint presentations, right? So in that case, I'm sure that they have some sort of a vetting process, quality control that would catch content that they don't want to be associated with, right? But I think that most likely doesn't go for the majority of the Danish companies out there. And I think that we all have to...
It's also just a matter of a couple of days, and then all of those that are vetting are also using AI to vet.
Yeah, exactly. I would claim that it becomes self-regulated at some point, because if your audience or your customers don't like your content, if they feel that your emails are irrelevant or in a bad tone, or you will get a response and it will self-regulate. It's like having an employee on your team who constantly have a bad tone in your customer service, right?
Yeah.
That will solve itself fairly fast.
I like you said, irrelevant. I've always thought that if writing a book about the future, I would call it relevant, because that's all it's all about, right? Staying relevant in everything, and staying relevant with AI and AI voices and the LLMs. It has to be you. It has to be the company that's relevant. It can't be the AI that's relevant. Then you're asking the wrong question.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point, right? That's back to the why. What is it we're trying to solve here, right? Is it are you focused on the tool or the problem?
Exactly. So even people saying that the AI is hallucinating and missing the point. They're not missing the power that it can deliver if it's used in a relevant setting or on the right why. But also the people saying that AI will fix everything are also missing the point, because they're doing the same. So I just think that this technology focus, weird for me being an AI lead, but it's actually wrong, right? It's completely wrong, because either side of it is not talking about the relevance.
No, I agree, but I think what is obvious to all of us is that the gimmicky side of AI is just so substantial that everybody has an opinion about it, right? And it tends to kind of take the focus for the real value-adding stuff, right? And I think right now, at the, I would say, early days of AI, this is kind of a problem, right? That we are so focused on, the newest YouTube video that is 100% AI generated, and it's impressive, but what's the value, right?
Yeah, and I'm also, I've said that before, I'm not testing all the new models out all the time. I couldn't do anything else then. I feel like some influencers keep on doing that, because there's also, it's not easy, but there's a recipe for doing that. There's a recipe for saying, now I go and test it, and I test it in that environment. It's sort of like, you can put it in an SOP to test the models, right? But talking value, figuring out what drives value, there's no SOP for that. That's more of you need to speak to people. You need to figure out what's relevant in different contexts. And then the world suddenly becomes much more disparate again, right? Completely different all the time. And you can't just go around, testing new models.
No, exactly.
I think new models bore me. They bore me so much. I couldn't find any worse use of my time than sitting around testing new models. And I'd rather go play a computer game.
Well, it's pretty impressive that you have already gotten to that stage. Compared to, for instance, the early days of, let's take cloud computing, hyperscalers, right? Think about how long time it took for that product really to mature to an extent where you could kind of have firm opinions on what it's good for and what it's not good for. What's the value proposition? What's the business case? That maturity journey took what? 10 years. I think, that's kind of what we're dealing with here. It seems like, we're picking up the speed for every generation of technology. So what is happening now with AI is exactly what you describe, too much fuss about models instead of focus on the business cases, a value add, right? So it ends up being a tooling discussion. And that has, happened within 6 months, 12 months. Right?
There's also, now when you say it this way, I also feel, I suddenly heard myself talk back to myself and say, I don't care about it. Because of course I know what a reasoning model is. Of course I know I have MCP A2A, all that, right? But it's, but for me, it always goes the other way around. I have an idea where this can be applied because it's the same basic principles for all of them. So I go look for the value case, and then when we have the value case, I say, how can we fix it with available tools? And that I assume will be able to fix it because I have a good hunch that it will. But, so there's this, instead of saying how this new avant-garde technical thing, what can it be used for? I try to take it the other way around, right? And knowing just enough about the AI models that it's okay.
Do you think there will be a consolidation in the market over the next 5 years? Will we have more or fewer platforms, models?
More. I think we'll have more. I think we'll have lots more. I think it's already commoditized. I think the DeepSeek moment showed that everyone can do it now with the 6 people in a basement. You never know if that's true, if that's actually what's going on in China, but it showed that everyone can do it. It's not that difficult to do, and you can make really, really big models at a much lower cost. So that will obviously commoditize a lot. We'll have European models. We'll soon have that, I'm pretty sure, even more than we already do with Mistral. And more local language-specific models. We'll have lots of those as well. So I think we'll have even more. And I think that even though a lot of players have talked about some sort of singularity AI model, the AI model to rule them all. The only thing we've actually seen are multiple disparate models that can do multiple different things very specifically and be good at that. Anthropic is now becoming good at agents, technical agents, coding. ChatGPT is very personal, and then suddenly ChatGPT was too sycophantic, even too personal, right? And then you have, the O1 and the 4O models who do different things, right? Reasoning. And so it just spreads out. The models do different things. So what we're looking for is, once again, AI is supposed to be the one ring to rule all of the other technologies. Now it can manage them. It can translate anything we want to do into any kind of technology, right? But now suddenly we're looking for the AI agent to rule all the AI agents. So you see the fractal just moves. As I also said earlier on the podcast, in very early episodes, that we're just moving fractals all the time. So right now we're just looking for the next thing to rule the AIs, right? Because now we have suddenly so many different AI models that we need to rule.
That's interesting.
It's almost beautiful.
Yes.
Anyway, Nicolai, this has been a terrific episode. I've really loved having you on the show. I think it's been a good conversation. I think it's been a really insightful conversation. Also been a conversation not just on, the peak of hype, but actually, from an operations room or from a room where we're trying to make things work every day, and for businesses that are running, as you said, 24/7, right? And you've done that for 25 years.
Yeah, pretty much. Not in leadership roles, but I've been in IT operations since beginning of the 2000s. Yep.
So it also means that there's some credibility to what you're saying and some depth to it.
I hope so.
It certainly felt that way. And I think this has been really terrific. I've really loved having you on the show. And I have one final question for you that you already alluded to a couple of times. I don't know if you have the same, but you already mentioned 2 constants, right? But are you ready for this last question?
Yeah, hit me.
So, Nicolai, what is the only constant?
The sentence, "the truth shall set you free," is printed on the original CIA headquarters. And it's a quote from John 8:32. And I think the truth, the pursuit for truth, the pursuit for clarity and for insight is at least a constant. And I think a significant part, if not all, of the greatest minds in the modern history of mankind have spent their lives on pursuit of knowledge and understanding. People like Plato and Aristoteles, Newton, Kierkegaard, and great minds. They have spent their whole life on understanding, and at a point in time where this was not necessarily associated with fame and wealth. And I think the human drive towards insight is constant. Unfortunately, it's not a linear curve towards the goal always, right? We find ourselves in dead ends once in a while. But I believe that on a global scale, this is a constant that mankind fortunately strives for clarity and insight. And I think that's pretty amazing.
That's a great constant, but also a constant that sort of challenges a little bit how you talked about technology moving in, moving out, moving in, moving out in a flux, right? What's the clarity there, Nicolai?
But I don't necessarily think that technology always brings us to a better place. Even though that I love technology, it's not necessarily always a linear curve towards something that is actually at the greater good for us. It's unfortunately quite difficult to back out of again. But that's back to, the pursuit for clarity and understanding that also entails, making wrong decisions once in a while, right? And redoing them. So let's see where that brings us. I don't know.
See if we will have more clarity as we move forward.
Yeah, but I think, we need to keep asking questions, and we need to spend 10 times more time on understanding than we do on judging. And if we embrace that, then I think we'll be just fine.
That's a great ending. Thank you for that, Nicolai.
Likewise.
Thank you for being on The Only Constant.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you liked this episode, share it with a friend or a colleague.